colleagues, thank you so much. We'd like to resume our program of this Create Symposium with two very experienced and seasoned leaders in the higher education landscape. And I'm particularly proud to introduce both of them, and they'll be sharing remarks virtually, and then we'll engage in question and answer. And of course, you are encouraged to contribute. First and foremost is Dr. Shirley Malcolm. Her pronouns are she and her. She is the director of Sea Change program that is associated with the American Association for the Advancement of Science, AAAS. And this is, of course, the largest scientific organization on the planet. She has a long and distinguished career as a scientist, as a leader of scientific organizations, particularly in the United States. She's a trustee at Caltech and a regent at Morgan State University. And I consider her to be a friend of the University of California. She'll be joined by our colleague Yvette Goulat, who is the Vice President of Graduate and Undergraduate Affairs, the Office of the President. She also holds the title of Vice Provost for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, as well as Chief Diversity Officer. Both of these individuals were asked to reflect on the University of California as a sea change system, right? A number of campuses are in various stages of securing Bronze Award recognition. But with the leadership of President Drake, the system now seeks to mobilize the power of 10 to really create waves through sea change. And so now at this time, I'd like to invite Shirley and Yvette to join us virtually and to share some opening remarks on the question, how will UC look different? Planning and mapping progress.
Doug, do you have a preference for who you would like to have start?
Well, let's have our visitor from DC, Shirley Malcolm, kick us off. How are you, Shirley?
Okay, I am willing to kick off things, but I will not speak very long. I prefer conversation. I seem to be spending a lot of time with the University of California. I was in a cohort meeting on yesterday, a really deep and rich discussion on data and on not only collecting it, but making sense out of it, and then using it to drive decision-making and to drive the kinds of decisions and strategies that you have to put in place. Today, I was able to join this discussion at the end when I was hearing about startup packages and mortgage assistance and faculty assistance and total hiring and retirement planning. Trained as an ecologist, that feels very familiar to me, looking at population age structure. But given that I won't say that about faculty, it's really more the case of career stage and understanding that you can't really just move one thing, that everything is connected to everything else, which is why it is so important that we think about this as very complex systems, first within an institution and then across the institutions. Understanding how complex all of this is and how much has to go into transforming the institutions as well as the systems. So if you understand all this, maybe those of you who have gone through this sea change process can forgive us those long and complicated guidance documents that are associated with sea change. I want to say that we are honored to be able to collaborate with the University of California institutions and system through sea change, STEM, equity, achievement, change, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. While the AAAS focus is predictably on those fields, because of the special DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility challenges of those fields, we are totally understanding that if you achieve this kind of transformation, it will affect every nook and cranny, every discipline, every office, every process and tradition of the institution. When we at AAAS learned about the Athena Swan program in the United Kingdom, we were inspired to adapt it for the United States. Doug indicated that I've been working on these issues for a long time. He's right. Over 45 years. We've always known that we needed system level change. We have always known this, but we just didn't know how we could possibly do it. And when we saw what Athena Swan was doing, we were able to say, well, we can make that work for us. Now there are differences. Athena Swan is focused on gender equality. In our case, we knew from the beginning that we had to look at gender equality, but also race, ethnic, as well as the intersectional issues. We want also to look at factors like LGBTQIA plus and disability. But we're also data-driven, and most institutions don't yet have the kind of reliable data that will allow us to take on those challenges right now. We have always known we needed seismic shifts and systemic change. So Athena Swan gave us a hint of how this might be achieved. And as we have seen the impact on some of their institutions that are of a more mature transformation initiative, where they have been involved in doing this work for like 12 years or more, we are more convinced than ever that only this kind of systemic approach has a possible chance of being effective. The changes will not happen overnight because the institutions did not get to be what they are overnight. And there will likely be pushback and resistance. But armed with data, research, and a compelling new narrative, you will be able to push ahead. The new narrative is revealed from the work that is being done now about how much better our research is, how much more responsive our technology is, how much more compelling our innovation is when it is done in a diverse and inclusive community. Every institution is different, including those within the same system. Context-specific, law-attentive strategies informed by the interventions that you have been undertaking over the years, as well as existing assets that you can see, can come together under an umbrella to drive transformation. The work of Sea Change is to bring the pieces together to help to form a solid base, a solid foundation, and very strong scaffolding to move forward. Identifying the problem areas, the inequities and challenges, and setting a realistic action plan for the barrier removal can get you there. Learning from your colleagues what their experiences have been, creating a big tent community of practice. So, what does a transformed institution look like? From what we'll see from our UK colleagues, transformed institutions are more productive. They're more efficient. They're more welcoming. They are places where people want to be, where they're people-centered with better products and better scholarship, better able to attract and retain faculty, staff, and students, because people will want to be at an institution that can accept their whole selves. Participation in the diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility activities and efforts are broad and deep within these institutions and tightly networked across the institutions. The institutional memory starts to bake in diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in ways that allow resilient structures to be put in place. While it is typical within systems that campus compete with each other, Sea Change supports each individually as they go for the goal in Sea Change recognition. But it is the system's nature that will allow you, I think, I really truly believe, to get there faster with more confidence, because you will have colleagues on this really important journey.
Thank you so much, Shirley, for describing the kind of vision and the mission of Sea Change, and that it's centered on people, but it's about system change to help people maximize their potential, and that has the effect of producing the very things that we all want: better research, better outcomes, a better sense of thriving. I now want to invite Yvette to consider the question, how will UC look different, planning and mapping progress?
Sure. Thank you, Doug. And good afternoon, Shirley. It is so wonderful to be here. And it's a terrible thing to have to follow you. So what I'm going to do, because you've laid out the vision so wonderfully, but what I thought I'd do is talk about how we got to considering Sea Change and embracing Sea Change as an approach. And then the extent to which the equity advisor role that you've talked about all day today is really central to the way we think about this in the future. But before I do that, I want to give a special thank you to the 3 early adopter campuses in Sea Change, Davis, Irvine, and Santa Cruz, because it was that charter Sea Change participation, the accomplishments that you've had as a result, the lessons that you've learned, and the perspectives that you've shared on system-wide engagement that have been really important to setting the stage for this next phase of institutional work to advance faculty diversity. So as all of you are aware, many of the university's biggest opportunities are rooted in issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that includes the diversity of the university's faculty. Enhancing faculty diversity is a priority of our legislature, of our regents, of our president, of our chancellors, of the academic senate, and of our students. And if I can quote President Drake, we have a once in a generation opportunity to transform the professoriate. So you heard this morning from Vice President Brown about how our system-wide goals are aimed directly at embracing that opportunity, increasing the degree production for our students from underrepresented groups who are first generation, who are Pell Grant recipients, and adding to our faculty, and allowing everyone, as Shirley has said so eloquently, to bring their whole selves to the work of research, study, teaching, learning, and working at our university. And as Vice Provost Carlson was discussing earlier today, the state has provided funding over the last several years to help us with that diversity, right? And so we have the Advancing Faculty Diversity Projects as one outcome of that funding. And within that, the expanded role of equity advisors. And one could argue that the expanded role of equity advisors is in many ways a proof of concept that intentional faculty professional development and accountability that shifts mindsets and actions around selection, hiring culture, climate retention, training, mentoring, all of the things that we've been talking about today can really help us achieve a diverse and culturally competent faculty for the 21st century students. And that aligns with the state's intent that greater faculty diversity will result in stronger learning outcomes for our students and in turn, greater degree completion. So it's with that transformation in mind that President Drake challenged us to research and adopt additional practices system-wide that would accelerate our institutional progress to recruit and retain a diverse faculty. So we reached out to Dr. Malcolm and to our charter Sea Change campuses. And with their help, we could see a value and expanding to the entire system participation in sea change in a way that would provide us with structures and mechanisms for stitching together the parts. And I'm hoping that Shirley will share later her analogy about the difference between a playbook and a game plan, because it's really the best way I've heard to describe what we're about to embark on. But we're trying to stitch together those parts, right? We've designed things, we've experimented with things, we've implemented things already. So we wanted to know sea change in what they would provide, right? The tools that they have, the resources, the training, the external consultation, the partners, the competition, right? The going for gold. Could that impact more faculty more quickly, and could it advance us further in achieving systemic change? So when an institution joins sea change, and in our case, a system joins sea change, what it means is that every campus conducts a self-assessment, they establish goals and metrics, and they create or they update their plan and their team. And then there are external reviewers who are going to assess that plan and give us an initial rating. And then every 5 years, the institution is re-reviewed to assess whether it stays at that rating or it moves upward. So we view sea change as additive to our existing approaches, with membership offering us access to tools and to guidance for that self-assessment and for that goal setting, for support for data and data analytics, support for campus level professional development that focuses on cultural competency and inclusion, and support for scholarship on faculty diversity, and having to have continuous improvement monitored by peer review. So we all, at this point, every campus, I'm happy to say, has applied for membership in Sea Change, and that includes consultations, webinars, trainings, convenings, and resource materials. We have access to professional development, including support for faculty to develop those strategies to eliminate those barriers, including how to use instructional technology and interactive and active learning, and principles of inclusive course design to improve our student outcomes. And then support for contributions to the research on faculty diversity and inclusive excellence. And that can be through contributions to the Sea Change research repository, or by serving as a reviewer of the content that's submitted for inclusion. So how does the role of the equity advisor fit? Sea Change requires that institutions analyze data, develop evidence-based plans, and demonstrate progress. What the equity advisor role contributes to in the current way, right, focusing on data, broadening definitions of merit, and identifying a full range of predictors of success for prospective faculty, is an essential practice that has the potential to become more institutionalized through this kind of assessment. Let's see, where are we now? Every campus, as I said, have joined Sea Change, and they're at various stages in their orientation. We are the first university system with Sea Change designation, and we'll be a community of practice learning from one another as we integrate the Sea Change approach of examining data, establishing goals and metrics for recruitment and retention, measuring these results, and participating in that external review and assessment. And we believe that with this investment, the university will be better positioned to recruit and retain diverse scholars who can in turn shape more equitable and inclusive learning opportunities for our students.
Wow. Thank you for clarifying why UC as a system decided to become a Sea Change system. And right now I want to open up the session to questions. And while folks are pondering that, you know, I want to pose a question that really sort of used to drive a lot of the perception of change at UC about 25 years ago and beyond. And that is to say that 25 years ago, one of the resistance points frequently was that there is this tension between excellence and diversity, right? And what's so challenging is, how do you convince, demonstrate to our colleagues who may be personally committed to diversity but see change as threatening, right? And so to what extent is this different?
I really want to answer that one. Okay. We, you know, the things have been totally turned on their head. people used to say that there was a tension between these things. And now, but the research says that essentially you can't have excellence without the diversity and inclusion. That in fact, that you're losing perspectives within the work, within the scholarship. And I think that there are some fields that have already demonstrated that. You think about the richness of music and the humanities and what have you, as we have been able to bring in other voices, not only his story, but her story as well. And that but we're seeing that within the sciences. We are seeing that innovation related to addressing some of the challenges that women face, that they tend to be disproportionately done by women researchers and innovators. We see that there are incomplete kinds of visions on some of the work if we aren't looking at through different lenses. So I think that this narrative shift is absolutely critical to just put down this first element of resistance, being you can't have excellence and equity at the same time. And what we're saying is you can't have excellence without the equity, diversity, and inclusion. And that's across the board. And there is a rich research base now that underscores all of this.
Yeah, I would say, have we run to ground every question? And if we haven't run to ground every question, is it because we haven't asked them and we don't have the perspectives in place to ask them? So how do we solve the challenges of a highly diverse world without the requisite knowledge and experience to ask those questions and pursue those lines of inquiry and to connect across disciplines to do that inquiry? And I think that that's impossible to do because we know how many questions have been unanswered or how many things are unknown because it's not research conducted with the perspectives of people of color, of women, of poor people, of all kinds of people. And we've certainly seen that in the pandemic. And so I think, without diversity, you have no excellence because you haven't run to ground as an institution all of the possible questions to solve a highly complex, diverse world's challenges.
I really appreciate those comments, and I want to encourage others to consider comments or questions. And in the meantime, I want to refer to something that you mentioned, Dr. Malcolm. You talked about resilient structures, right? Resilient structures. And when I think of that term, I often default back to people. Right? Not as structures, but in some sense, they enact whatever the sort of operation or function of that structure. And so how do you, what does resilient structures mean? And how does that concept relate to the broader aim?
We've had quite a bit of construction in our neighborhood where I live in Georgia. And I watched the people put up the walls, and then they reinforce those walls. And I watch them put on the rafters. And do you know what holds those buildings up?
I hope a foundation.
Well, no. I mean, basically the foundation is what it's built upon, but what actually holds it up is that each piece leans into every other piece. You think about resilience is a concept that is used a lot in architecture. I mean, you understand, you notice I use the term seismic. There, the notion that in fact you must be able to take account the things that will buffet you, the winds, you've got to look at the possibilities of earthquakes or whatever. And there are these things within societies as well, court challenges, the kinds of questioning about the value of education. All kinds of things are always kind of coming at you. And the notion of building resilient systems has to be integral, I think, to any higher education institution. It can't be dependent on a single individual. But an individual can give you insight, an individual can give you inspiration, but you want it to be dependent on everybody dependent on everybody else, that they're leaning into each other, and that is the way that they will go forward. Whether or not you lose a person, someone will pick up the slack, because it's going to take continuous effort and continuous improvement to make the kinds of transformations that we're talking about.
You know, and I think, Doug, about the pandemic and the medical centers, and how the medical centers were so quick, relatively quick, to be able to put in place a COVID response, right? Because they have a playbook. They have a game plan for pandemics.
Yes, they do.
They do. They have a game plan for pandemics. We don't have a game plan for pandemics on the academic side. And what I think we've learned from this pandemic was that we don't have instructional resilience, because the most vulnerable people in our community suffered the most. The production of our faculty, our women faculty, and our people, our scholars of color plummeted off the cliff during this pandemic. Our students went home without the right kinds of equipment to be able to be successful in a Zoom remote environment. There were all kinds of ways that we were not resilient. And if we come out of this pandemic without an instructional resilience plan that's built on inclusion, that's built on equity, then we will fail again the second time. We did extraordinary, don't get me wrong. We shifted to remote work in some extraordinary ways, but we left a lot of people behind. And it's going to take us years to get back that research productivity, to bring those students back to levels of performance and engagement that they had prior to the pandemic. So I think that there are a lot of lessons about resilience to be learned here. And I hope that in our sea change assessment, we'll be looking at what did the most vulnerable people need during this pandemic, and what didn't they get? And how can we make sure that we are resilient in the future with those people in mind?
Yvette keeps throwing these things at me that I know she wants me to talk about my game plan versus my playbook. I'm a big football fan, and we talk about the fact that I like all kinds of football, and I keep telling people there's a difference between a playbook and a game plan. A playbook is all the things that you could possibly do. But a game plan has to basically be designed for who you're going to play next Sunday. And so this notion about which pieces are you going to pull out? I mean, it's the same thing like you talked about with the pandemic, where we just weren't ready. We weren't ready. We were not equipped to be able to address the kinds of issues that occurred. I mean, in my case, as a trustee, and sitting there with the president, trying to even decide if we were going to have real bodies on campus, and in having to make all these decisions with incomplete information. But the other thing is, I see a question in the chat that I would want to respond to. Okay. And that is about this, what is included within Sea Change. Now, I will just tell you, because it is AAAS, we only look deeply at science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. But as a person who works in higher ed, in governance, if you start having these kinds of conversations about any part of the institution, all parts of the institution are up for grabs. You've got to look at the arts, the humanities, and everything else, because you're not going to, for example, if you decide you've got to think differently about merit, and how you define it and who gets to decide whether that's meritorious or not. You're not just going to do that in science. You've got to do that campus-wide. You're not going to change rules related to promotion and tenure and advancement for just one part of the campus. You're going to do it institution-wide. And so it's not excluded. Nobody is excluded. Because you've got to be a part of the conversation about what you have to become, what you have to transform into. Speaking of, metaphorically, I love the idea, and I think I showed on one of the events that I did for Doug and Marguerite, what does transformation look like? And I talked about the origins of sea change and where sea change, the phrase came from. And it's in The Tempest. And if you go and you look at that particular part, there's a reference there that is subtle to the idea that this is the transformation is profound. It's akin to the transformation that occurs when an oyster secretes nacre to basically protect its very delicate, fragile insides from a microscopic organism that gets into between it and its shell, or sand that gets between it and its shell. And that kind of transformation gives you a pearl. That is the level of change that you're really talking about. So that diversity, equity, and inclusion are normative. They're not something that you do on the side. They're not an intervention that you undertake, that they are a part of who you are.
So there is no trade-off. There's no trade-off in engaging with diversity and excellence. In fact, you need diversity in order to realize excellence. And I think that concept, is particularly powerful. And I want to make a comment about how do we actualize that, right? Because at an earlier session, I talked about how equity advisors really do miraculous things without explicit authority, right? Because of the peer-to-peer engagement model that's generally used. And instead, they use persuasion, right? And in drawing on the metaphor that you used, Shirley, given the faculty-centric culture of all of our campuses, where authority is largely diffuse or decentralized, in order to affect sea change, it then requires all faculty in some way, or many faculty in some way, to engage with sea change. And so, having said that, do campuses that succeed require 100% participation?
Is that a question?
A rhetorical question. Please answer.
Oh, okay. I was going to say it has to be rhetorical. You don't get 100% participation in anything. If you're handing out money, you're not going to get 100% of the people going to get their share. What you need to do is you've got to get to critical mass. You've got to get to enough people that you begin to change, to alter the culture, okay? And enough doesn't necessarily even have to be half. There's data now about women on boards, that in fact that one woman as a token is very difficult to make anything happen. Two, it can be a little bit easier, but you start getting 3, 4, where they are able to amplify each other's voices and able to build off of each other's strengths, that's when you start to see their influence, because you're right, it's persuasion, their influence really take hold. But one of the things that I hope that is realized is that the ecosystem that we're talking about extends beyond each individual institution. It extends beyond even the system. It extends to the entire structure by which we do scholarship within this country. And that there are these other forces that are calling for questions of accountability, that are calling for how are we going to serve everyone well? And I think that those are the kinds of things that we have an opportunity, especially California, has an opportunity to demonstrate. I mean, everybody says everything happens in California first, and then everybody else will get it, okay? Is there an opportunity for California to lead in terms of saying, how are we going to, in fact, take advantage of the rich, diverse potential workforce, potential citizenry that we have that is here? And if you can do it first, you can always be in the lead. And as one of my friends once told me, the scenery only changes for the lead dog.
You know, Doug, your question made me think about a project once, you know, so there's a whole system, right? You, as equity advisors, you know that you have different tools in your toolbox for what works. Some people need to see the evidence first before they can commit. Other people, they need to feel it viscerally. But I'm reminded of a project we sponsored in our UCI HBCU initiative, right? Which has as one of its goals for our faculty to see talent in places it might not otherwise consider talent to emerge from. And this was a project, I think it was at Davis, and I want to say it was in atmospheric science, and it was bringing students from HBCUs, Tuskegee and a couple of others to the campus for summer research. The second year, their proposal got a lot bigger in terms of money. So of course that made us wonder, what do they need more money for? So we asked them, and they say, you know, you can't get students from Tuskegee to Davis in atmospheric science unless you bring their mothers and their grandmothers and their families to experience it. And they began, this is a group of faculty beginning to learn that students of color make decisions differently about where they go to graduate school. And they were willing to, they learned that, they saw that, and they were investing in making sure that happened. So I think we have a lot of experimentation, a lot of learning that's taking place across the system. It would be fantastic for us to compile and capture that, demonstrate that. And I think we are already leaders in so many ways. And this is an opportunity for us to be, to demonstrate the systemic nature of the leadership and the innovation, I think sometimes that we have in this space.
And it will be called the UC Playbook.
With every campus having a game plan.
Right.
You know, I think
I hate football.
the timing of this shift to sea change for UC, it's worth noting that about 26, 27 years ago, voters in the state passed Proposition 209, that changed the Constitution. And we've been existing within it as a state institution. Of course, that very concise change to the Constitution prohibits consideration of race, gender, and national origin in admissions and hiring in publicly funded institutions, post-secondary institutions. And what's striking is that over time, at least as I've seen it, the University of California has sort of at first struggled with doubt about what was possible, pushed through fears of threats of litigation. And increasingly, and I think Susan Carlson shared some of the data, that it's quite clear that we're figuring out ways to mobilize talented pools of scholars in this case. And that in some sense our fears, right, our fears about 209 held us back. And now 25 years plus afterward, we have this remarkable opportunity with Sea Change to really transform the system when many people 25 years ago didn't want it to change. Fear change. And so as I listened to the architect of Sea Change, Dr. Shirley Malcolm, and one of the enablers at the system-wide level, our colleague, Dr. Galat, I'm thinking, what's the one thing that you hope for when you visit in person in 2 years or 5 years? What do you want to see that lets you know that you're a part of not just a Sea Change campus, but indeed a Sea Change system?
So Doug, that's a good question, because the university has never been, as far as I know, sued for violations of 209, which suggests that we probably weren't pushing the envelope enough if we hadn't had practices that came close to that. And I'm not suggesting that the university should be sued, but I do think
that.
you know that this is, but I do think that we would. The data would show a greater sense of belonging. We would see that we had better faculty retention. We would see greater student retention. We might see declines in our caseloads for around student mental health or basic needs. We would not hear students say just fatalistically, can you just tell me where the toxic labs are so I can stay away from them? We would hear students excited and enthusiastic about their experience and their journey. We would see those time to degree numbers reducing. We would see more students from HSIs and HBCUs and tribal colleges in our graduate programs. We would see more of our students from our own HSIs and other of our campuses. We would have, in effect, be growing our own graduate students from our undergraduates, and we would see the evidence of that. So I think that in 2 short years, we could see a lot from work that was done for some deep assessment, right? You know, looking at how we use fellowship money in our graduate programs. Are we only admitting students who are URM if we can fund them from, you know, Coda Robles scholarship, right? Fellowship, right? I mean, are we not taking risks or not admitting students if somebody else doesn't make it possible for us to do it? We would see changes in those kinds of activities that we now see in department.
So I guess there's no mystery. What Yvette was describing is precisely what Pamela Brown talked about. The 3 UC 2030 goals, right? They're actually very elegant and very simple. To produce 200,000 new degree recipients above the projected 1 million between 2020 and 2030, while closing equity gaps, right, among a range of different populations. Grow the faculty by 1,000 while diversifying it compositionally, right? And to do this now in less than 10 years. And I think the work that the existing equity advisors have been involved in at your various campuses have a lot of momentum on the ground. And with Sea Change, I hope we're able to leverage it as a system so that we feel that we're part of something bigger and that we can pick up more opportunities for growth and change. And so, Shirley, when you visit 2 to 5 years from now, what's the one thing you want to see besides a screen?
I think the one thing that I would want to see would be people who really seem like they're happy to be there. And I know that sounds a little strange. It sounds a little touchy-feely, but you can tell places that are toxic. You can tell places that have a lot of tension in them. You can tell places where there's high levels of belonging. I see a note within the chat from Julie Carlson about budgets and the fact that people often will hide behind budget decisions. Only thing I want to say, Julie, is when you see that, would you come see me? I chair the Finance and Facilities Committee for the Board of Regents at the University at Morgan State University. I can tell you what a budget that's people-centered is supposed to look like, that is diversity-driven is supposed to look like. And I can help you to ask the kinds of questions that can push back on some of this. And I think that it's a smart move to say, this is what people will say, just like the fit word when they talk about faculty and the merit word when they talk about promotion. The budget word is one of, they make the assumption that the DEIA work has to be on top of the existing budget. It actually is instead of the existing budget. A DEI framed budget is an efficient budget. And so people are putting up false choices when that kind of stuff happens. And so you just send me an email.
Well, with that, Shirley, and that invitation to everyone, I'm going to be sharing your email to everyone, Shirley. But I want to thank Shirley Malcolm and our colleague Yvette Goulat for the conversation about how will UC look different as we work through sea change as a system in our individual campuses. We want to pivot now to action planning for sea change, but let's give them a hand.